Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mariana Ribon, and I'm one of the organizers of this year's J. Irwin Miller Symposium. I'd like to welcome you all back to the Yale School of Architecture and to this inaugural and virtual Yale Mental Health Symposium, Beyond the Visible, Space, Place, and Power in Mental Health. Over the past 3 weeks, we have gathered with the common goal of furthering our collective capacity to improve access to mental health services and destigmatizing perceptions of mental health embedded in the building environment. Tonight, we convene for the closing event of the year's symposium. We have heard inspiring reflections of the hospital and the home. And now we take a step back to explore the scale of the city. This final panel focuses on the structures and systems that operate in urban environments and impact mental health. Spatial inequalities in cities play a critical role in determining whether individuals can access mental health care. The momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement has amplified the need to consider the intersections of racial and economic inequalities with mental health. This spring and summer, the unequal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need for equal access to mental health care as millions of city residents had their lives upended and struggled to navigate new realities. The city has long been a contested site, historically a place for both opportunity and exclusion for BIPOC communities. Discrimination in home lending, police brutality, and housing segregation have fueled the enormous divides that characterize cities today with long-lasting implications on economic, social, and health disparities across neighborhoods. We have heard from Mindy Thompson-Fulilove on the communities that have been fractured and the need for social integration. As practitioners that co-create urban environments, we must understand how our work maps onto the city's physical and social geographies and reassert the link between urban space and mental health. At any time throughout this session, you can post questions in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the panel, we will unmute guests to ask their questions directly to the panelists. Please stick around for closing comments for the symposium. After this panel, our Dean Deborah Burke will be joining us to reflect on the event, followed by the organizing team. Our discussion today will be led by Justin Garrett Moore. Justin is an urban designer and the executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission. He has extensive experience in urban planning and design, from large-scale urban systems, policies, and projects to grassroots and community-based planning, design, and art initiatives. At the Public Design Commission, his work focuses on prioritizing quality and excellence for the public realm and fostering accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in New York's public buildings, landscapes, and arts. He's a member of the American Planning Association AICP Commission, the Urban Design Forum, and Black Space. He is also an adjunct faculty member at Columbia University and co-founder of Urban Patch. Thank you, Justin, for moderating our discussion tonight, and for the work you are doing at Yale this semester with your class in partnership with Morgan State University, Different, and the city. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. And I'm really excited and happy to be here today as part of the Yale Mental Health Symposium and for the city panel. We have three wonderful speakers this evening: Molly Rose Kaufman, Bryan Lee Jr., and Nupur Chaudhury. So I believe we have a video introducing our first speaker, which will be Molly Rose Kaufman. Molly Rose Kaufman is a community organizer, journalist, and youth worker. Her writing has appeared in Yes Magazine, Kinfolk Magazine, and the New York Times. In 2008, she co-founded the University of Orange, the Free People's Urbanism School in Orange, New Jersey. She has a BA from Hampshire College and an MS in journalism from Columbia University. Kaufman was a 2016 Civic Liberal Arts Fellow at the New School and a 2018 Next City Urban Vanguard Fellow. She currently serves as the University of Orange Provost and teaches at Eugene Lang. Additionally, she serves on the board of the Jersey City Public Libraries and the World Fellowship Center. And this Molly is joining us.
Hi, Justin.
Good evening, good evening. And first I should say quick kind of note and caveat that all of us on this panel have known and worked with each other because this is coalition work, this is movement work to address these issues in the city. So it may be a little more kind of familiar and relaxed than if we were strangers. So first, Molly, we really thought it was important to kick off this evening's discussion and to kind of set an arc by really talking about how we're connecting this work of health, social justice, social change to the work of living in, producing, designing, building, and occupying the city. So as we just learned, you've been instrumental in the development of the University of Orange. And so the first question is really to talk about the work at University of Orange. So there you've been building a collective capacity for people to create more equitable cities, right? So that's an objective that we want to talk about, more equitable cities. And as we begin this panel, can you give us a little bit of background for why U of O has focused on inequality in cities and in our communities?
Sure. Thanks so much, Justin. And welcome and thank you to all of you joining us today. I just want to honor that I know everyone has a lot on their minds and their hearts, and it's so important when we come together in spaces like this. So thank you for making it. And I also want to honor the people who maybe couldn't make it today, you know? So University of Orange, we are based in Orange, New Jersey, which is my family's hometown. And we started in 2008. We're a free school and an urbanism school. And as Justin said, we're dedicated to education for equitable cities. We say that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. In order to graduate, we ask that people take 2 courses. Independent studies are allowed, that you vote. It doesn't have to be in a governmental election since people are excluded from that right. Volunteer, attend a city meeting, and have fun with your neighbors. And so our classes really run a spectrum from English as a second language to music theory to like making your own harmonica microphone. And it's very much about really uplifting the gifts and resources in our community and really looking at our neighbors and ourselves as resources and assets to each other. We would very much say that it is impossible to have a conversation about mental health and the city without understanding the role that racist policies have played in shaping our cities and structuring the way our built environment works and the way it influences us. And there are many threads that inform the founding of University of Orange. As Justin said, this is relational work, this kind of work. And so my mom and my grandmother were co-founders of University of Orange, but we came together with community leaders and activists in the city and people who just really, really loved this city, even though it had been undermined consistently by policies that really kind of enact the racism in our society. And so at U of O, while we offer classes of all kinds, we also really teach our approach to restoration urbanism. And that's first grounded in understanding that our cities have been physically and socially fractured by a series of racist planning policies. And those policies from segregation to redlining to deindustrialization, planned shrinkage, mass incarceration, and that these have consistently undermined the ability of people to create healthy society. We don't create health individually, we create health together in society. And I think, and I know something that Nupur has really consistently pushed is that we stay really connected at that intersection of public health and urban planning and really think about the social determinants of health as people are engaging in their planning and their work with the built environment. So what kind of access to recreation do you have? What's in your near environment? What's going on in your schools? This is really how we create health. And all of these policies that are depriving people of resources and pushing people around are consistently undermining our capacity to create health together. So at U of O, we say that we're dedicated to reweaving the social fabric and reknitting the physical environment in ways that can create the connections physically and socially that we all need to be healthy.
That's really great. And I just a quick biographical note. So my own work, Urban Patch, is also kind of a family-run, co-founded enterprise. And I think it underlines something really important, that this is intergenerational work, right? And the idea of community, it's a sort of abstract word that people talk about all the time, community, but family is in a way kind of a point of reference for a lot of people's sense of community. And so I just enjoy kind of knowing that U of O as an institution in a way is something that is kind of rooted in this most fundamental understanding of community that we have with our loved ones, right? And we talk about health and mental health, the kind of the concept of those that care for you and those that you care for is something that we need to expand our vocabulary, but very often it starts at home, right? So yeah, it's really wonderful. And I think it's really great that you and your family and all the community members that are involved in U of O are kind of working to help people better understand and find agency, right, in addressing some of these legacy issues that you mentioned, right? The kind of constant and systemic and structural undermining, to use your term, of people in place. But in your work in communities, what do you find are some of the issues and forces that are impacting people and their health and mental health today, right? There are all the legacy issues that we know are there, but what are some of the things that you find that people are really kind of finding challenging now, whether that's related to everything we're all going through right now, or some of the more recent patterns that have had some issues in our communities?
Sure, and I realize that I would be, thanks Justin, I realize that I would be remiss if I also didn't say that my mom, who's my co-founder at U of O and dear colleague, is Mindy Fully-Love, who gave a keynote address as part of this conference, and also a social psychiatrist who studied, she's really got into the work of studying health epidemics in low-income communities of color in the 80s and 90s, starting with the AIDS epidemic, but then that really led her to start expanding out from beyond just the sites of people to the sites of the neighborhoods, to looking at the scale of the city and what was happening within the city that was allowing this really disproportionate way that illness was falling upon people. And she was taught by her urbanism teacher this notion that if we always quote him as saying that the same way a doctor knows that to heal a boil, to treat a boil on the skin, you have to treat the whole body. And urbanist knows if there's a problem in the neighborhood, there's a problem in the city. But so this is to say, Justin, that I think we can't disentangle the emerging problems that we're seeing today from these sets of issues that have brought us to this point. And I think something that's really on our minds a lot about at University of Orange that we talk about is a body of our work about collective recovery, but it's how does the collective come together to heal? And each of these series of policies and each of these things that have ripped communities have harmed our ability to be collective. And so the situation that we're seeing now is the situation of disaster falling upon fracture and these converging crises. And so that I think the sort of myriad issues that are emerging, I don't think in terms of the mental health crises that people are facing right now, I don't know that we have time tonight to walk through all of them, right? It's so many, but the real crisis that we're trying to think about is how do we think about how we solve them collectively? Like, for example, if you read about an instance of what they're calling Zoom towns, and people are moving, leaving cities, moving places and buying houses because they can just commute by Zoom. But, and all due respect to people who, can't work and school their kids all in an apartment, all that stuff, all due respect, like do what you have to do. But at the same time, people are thinking within these really small units. They're not thinking about the collective. Are we thinking about the cities that we're leaving behind? Are we thinking about how we're driving up the housing costs in these new places where we're landing? So how do we broaden our sphere of influence so that we're really thinking about the collective? Because that's how we're all going to get through this with as much of our mental health intact as we can. So
yeah, I really love this point and your kind of challenge, right? That we're all going through this moment now, and we want to react and respond and care for what's happening now, but we have to understand it in the whole, and you treat the whole patient. I like that kind of comparison, and something that it makes me think of is, obviously, your comment about doing things as a collective, but people often will call it the crisis of the commons, right? That there's this disconnect between our kind of collective experience and responsibilities and all of that, and that there have been intentional breakdowns of that, right? And so people talk about kind of an imaginary the commons, but the reality in the United States is our commons in the origins of our history included things like slave markets, right? So, and for hundreds of years, this idea of the commons is already, what do you call it, a fracture, right? There are already these things that we need to look at and address in a more complete way to understand kind of where we all are today. Speaking of kind of commons, we're in a kind of a new version of common here, and this will be sort of a faster question, hopefully. You have always, you're building kind of an institution, a new kind of form of collective work and action. And we're here hosted by an institution, right? One of our oldest institutions in the US, and one of the most well-resourced institutions. And so in the work that you've been doing at U of O and addressing these issues, how do you kind of take on this challenge of the institution and the role of kind of teaching, or the role of learning? I think we have to combine the two, and kind of what would your recommendation be for a way that we can kind of teach and learn together to address some of this work?
So at University of Orange, one of the things that I always end up highlighting as something that I love so much about being a part of like joining a U of O class is that they're intergenerational, and also people are coming together from different educational backgrounds, and I mean beyond also just different race and class backgrounds, but you realize how much the way that the like segregation just keeps going and going, so that when we're in a classroom, often we're only with people who are our same age, and we're only with people who might be coming from a similar education background, and it really just broadens your mind so much to be learning alongside people coming from all different backgrounds, and it's such a like just a joyous experience of learning. And I think people can have such a vast array of experiences of learning. It's also a really profound way to build, to just grow community. Like just learning together is really just exciting, and also something that I think we found is super interesting is just the way that creating space for people to connect and share around their stories of Orange has really grown their civic engagement. So just creating that space for people to come together really can just grow that, I think. So, but at University of Orange, in terms of the way that we think about our collective recovery work, and that work really started with my mom, Mindy's research group in the 90s when they were working with families in Harlem to heal from this trauma that was really falling upon the neighborhood. And it was really how do people start to regain that sense of collective after their neighborhood and community had been undermined so consistently by so many different forces. And then when September 11th happened, they were this research group uptown in Harlem, and they were like, everyone's talking about the site of this injury and that it's falling on certain people, but actually it's falling on all of us. And actually we have some pathways that we know about from our work that can help people heal. And part of that is really thinking about this idea of collective recovery, and that every organization can have, and every person can have a role to play in healing if they're invited into that process. So for us, the way we've been teaching that is first to just share that invitation, like what's your organization and how can your organization contribute to healing right now? And then encouraging organizations to really think about how they're helping their constituents, but also connect and network with other organizations beyond what you're already doing. And then also, how are you advocating to the government to demand what the people need right now? And then we say the 4 tasks of collective recovery are remember, respect, learn, and connect. So I would say that that's what I would encourage any institution to do. Yale, like really think about, build your relationships beyond, how are you advocating for what people need right now, and then think about remember, respect, learn, and connect. And that's what we've been working on.
Right. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love the sort of the charge to the institutions and to us as individuals, those that are participating in the institutions, right? We're a kind of a mechanism to find new accountability. Thank you, Molly.
Thanks, Justin.
And well, I've got some kind of follow-up questions for me of our group discussion at the end for you. But for now, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you again, Molly.
Thank you. I'm going to go.
So thank you. And we're going to have Bryan Lee is up next. So Bryan C. Lee Jr. is an architect, educator, writer, and design justice advocate. He is the founder and design director of Co-Locate Design, a nonprofit multidisciplinary design practice in New Orleans, Louisiana, dedicated to expanding community access to design and creating racial, social, and cultural equity spaces. He has led 2 award-winning youth design programs nationwide and is the founding organizer of the Design Justice Platform. He was most recently noted as one of the 2018 Fast Company Most Creative People in Business. Fast Company is very cool for these who don't read it. A USC MacArthur Civic and Media Fellow, and the youngest design firm to win the Architectural League's Emerging Voices Award in 2019. So really excited to have Bryan. Bryan is the man with the plan, and really doing so much incredible work. And really to dovetail off of Molly's comment that she was just leaving us with, pushing and challenging people and institutions to do work that is about the collective, right? What do we all collectively need to survive, right? And to thrive, but it's some cases it's like, what do we need even just
how do we base level
survive?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so yeah, just agreeing. How do we get to the base level of survival so that ultimately we can get to thriving as we continue to push this work along?
Yeah, exactly. So we just heard from Molly some really great background on kind of how we got here, what some of these big issues are, and what communities are facing when it comes to the link between health and especially mental health, and how that connects with our built environments, our urban environments. So your work is focused more explicitly on the direct role of design in the built environment as it impacts these issues, and that it's taken many different forms. And you've sort of been a kind of leader and organizer in the role of design justice as being a way that we might kind of understand that link. So can you tell us just a little bit kind of the 101 version of design justice and how it might link to this issue of mental health and healthy communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So design justice all really kind of came from this format or this conversation around colloquial architecture at its very core, which really just is to say that there's a sophisticatedly informal use of formal architectural language that is happening already in communities, right? And if you can find that language of place and be able to learn that language of place, you can actually serve communities in a much more broad and direct way. And so design justice then seeks to really, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, envision spaces and places that are considering the racial, social, and cultural justice of that place. And then by its very nature, challenging the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a means to maintain levels of oppression. And so our job from a design justice perspective is to envision things that ultimately disrupt the narratives that are put in place by the standard forms of practice, right? And so it is absolutely a way for us to kind of challenge and change those systems. And then if we recognize those systems as forces that are put upon us, and we're ultimately thinking about that through that lens of whatever form of oppression that exists within that context, whether it's driven by race, gender, so on and so forth, we have to then be able to make those next set of leaps, right? And so especially when we're talking about the relationship to mental health in our environment, we just heard, consistently the conversation that racism itself is a public health crisis, but only so much and so that we recognize that public health is obviously determined by so much of what we do in public space, right? How we build what we build, how people interact with what we build, and those relationships, about 50-60% of the kind of core social determinants of health have a spatial implication attached to them. And so if we remain complicit, then we are never really going to ever be able to solve the large issues in our world. I always have this kind of massive irritation with all of our institutions, whether it be academia or organizational leadership, that really starts to frame our positionality as one that is both too small to address the large issues and too big to deal with the small issues. So we found this cozy little spot where we don't have to do shit, and that is a problem, because we inherently are the kind of bearers of so much of the decision making around public land. So I know it was a little rambly, but that's kind of where design justice kind of comes to play.
Well, no, I think this is really in a short time kind of letting people know that essentially this is about power. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. And designers, it's this kind of curious psychology we have, like, oh, we're the visionaries, we kind of, with the pen, we make the world, but then at the same time, oh, that's out of my control, right? So like those two things are just in constant tension. And we have to find like better ways to kind of own kind of what the ethics of our practice are, what way we kind of navigate the world, right, and the people that we're working with.
We have such a piss poor way of analyzing our relationship to power as designers. We've done such a poor job of understanding where we lie in that spectrum, and ultimately recognizing that we are often conduits to power. Power exists on either end of a spectrum, and we are shepherding that power into physical manifestation oftentimes. And so it gives us the out to say, well, we're just doing what the money says, we're just doing what the client says, we're just doing what the power says, and ultimately we are codifying or reifying the kind of conditions of that power has reproduced over and over and over again.
Right, absolutely. So our next place I wanted to go was really dovetails into this question, right? So many of these issues, the power structures, kind of the environment that we're all existing in, right? These have been kind of designed and built, literally engineered into our places and communities and cities for a very long time, right? For generations, hundreds of years. And the challenges though is that, only kind of a small fraction of the world is being kind of redesigned or reconstructed at any given moment. But something that's important that you're bringing up is that there is this sort of vision and creative practice, right? That we can challenge and shift and discuss things like narrative. So what are a few examples of the kinds of projects, design work that you've been involved in that help us with design and with what we can do now to shift some of these dynamics to make healthier outcomes to deal with harm and care in our communities.
Certainly, certainly. So before I answer that, I want to take one step back to just kind of give some framing for the work I will talk about here shortly. One of the things that we, in this work, we are constantly in conversation with communities. It is a necessity, right? It is not simply about outreach or even simply about engagement. It is oftentimes a matter of how we organize communities and build power. And so one of the recognitions that was constant within that framework was that we used to hear, we want to fight gentrification over and over and over again. We'd always hear, we want to fight gentrification. And there's this lack of understanding of what gentrification truly is. And so we took this step back to kind of really fully understand what and how we are doing this, and really started to say, well, gentrification is the process of dying scaled up from the human being to the scale of the neighborhood. And there are so many different ways to die that we need to understand how neighborhoods die. We need to understand the slow, meticulous process that happens. It's not, happening instantly. It is happening over many decisions, over many, many years. And so we have to be very clear about the fact that gentrification or dying or transition or whatever language we want to use in relationship to the displacement of culture and people is really defined by understanding the kind of length of time that defines that. And so in order to understand that, we then have to break that down to the kind of broader context of the functional needs, or the kind of the functional needs of the built environment, or the foundational needs. And really that gets into what Molly was mentioning a little bit earlier, right? When we're talking about the kind of collectivist nature of neighborhoods and communities, health lies in the hands of the people that exist. There's a permeability that relies on health. And so, or that sustains the health of neighborhoods and communities. And so the projects that I want to work on, that I do work on, and that I seek out for kind of a embedded wisdom within the walls of the design, are usually ones that seek to find value in that functional needs of the built environment and to manifest that through the work. And so the couple that I have had the privilege to work on, the planning of the crucial one, which is the Claiborne Innovation District here in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is this 60-year process in which a healthy, vibrant Black community was cut through with a highway, which is a common story. We all know it over and over and over again across the country and really across the world. And what we've seen out of that community, what we saw out of that community was 400 live oak trees that were shredded and moved off of the site. We saw nearly 400 businesses shuttered over that time. And over that time, culture had to act as a solve. Community had to act as a solve to that trauma and attempt to maintain its communal relationship to that space. And so that's what happened, but it never really was able to stitch itself back together. And so at least from the neighborhood standpoint. And so you've continued to see dissolution of buildings and people out of that particular community. And so in 2017, we had the opportunity to work on a 19-block plan that really started to define the way that we attempt to stitch back these two halves of a community that were separated by way of this highway. And we, again, organized for many, many months, nearly a year of work just on the organizing and outreach component of it, and making sure that the community's voice was not just heard, but translated, and the spatial implications that were defined by our elders and by even those of us that, our ancestors who had passed before were heard. Our young people were heard in the meetings. We were making sure that it wasn't just a peripheral explanation of how the building was going to be regardless of their commentary, that it was done by way of their commentary, right? So
Right.
yeah, so it has to be that, or else it is doomed to again reproduce the same outcomes you see. So that's one that I often point to. The other is on the other end of the spectrum, which is not a design project by quote unquote a series of architects. It is Clara Street in the architects, right? It kills me, right? But there's a street here in New Orleans called Clara Street. You can look it up, and you can track it back to post-Katrina to now. But it's this group of neighbors who have created essentially this park space for the young people on the block or in that neighborhood. And so they by hand build, swings and benches and seating and tables. And it is one of the most active streets for our elders, for adults, and for young people, all living and working and hanging out in the same space. That doesn't happen very often, and they found something in that. And so when we talk about honoring the griots, honoring the storytellers, honoring the community, the extant community, it is just that we want to look at. It doesn't always have to come from the source of quote professionalized designers to do so. And then the last one I'll quickly mention is Casa Familia in San Isidro, which has been a tremendous project to watch over the last 3 to 4 years, in which they explicitly tie in the social services and the kind of public health considerations into a community that already existed and was already doing this work, but didn't have necessarily the infrastructure to maintain it over time at a healthy rate. And so those 3 projects, I think, are ones that I would point to look at.
That's great. Those are great examples. And I want to put a pin in something which I think kind of is a thread across all of these, which is that community engagement isn't some extra thing. It's not something that another person is doing, that it is simply design, right? If, we're changing the environment for all people and everyone is the client, right? And so the kind of the community engagement is just the underlying lining of these sort of messed up power structures, right? And if you kind of own that as a part of design process, then I think we can get to some different outcomes.
Absolutely.
With that, I'm going to say thank you, and we'll circle back with our group discussion. Thank you very much, Bryan.
All right.
All right. Next is Nupur Chaudhury. Can you bring yours, come on screen, Nupur? All right. So Nupur Chaudhury is a bridge builder and translator in the fields of urban planning and public health. For more than 15 years, she has developed and implemented strategies to support residents, communities, and neighborhoods, challenging power structures to build just, strong, and equitable cities. She has led coalition building efforts after Superstorm Sandy, redeveloped power structures in villages in India, and developed a citizen planning institute for public housing residents in Brownsville, Brooklyn. She is a member of the American Planning Association, co-chair of its Healthy Communities Interest Group, a board member of the University of Orange, all in the family here, and founding chair of Made in Brownsville, wonderful organization in Brownsville, Brooklyn. She is a fellow of the Urban Design Forum and holds degrees from Columbia University for her MPH, New York University for her Master's Urban Planning, and Bryn Mawr College for her BA in Growth and Structure of Cities. So welcome, Nupur, my good buddy.
Thanks, Justin. So lovely to have some time to chat with you.
Yes, yes. So I'll jump right in, kind of with this conversation about how we collaboratively kind of work to help make healthy places, right? What's the process for this? So as we heard, you've worked in many different kinds of communities and contexts. places like Brownsville or Niagara Falls here in New York. But how are coalitions coming together to use tools for urban restoration as we create healthier places for all?
Sure. So first of all, thanks so much for having me on this panel, and thanks so much to the team at Yale for making this happen. So Justin, I love this question because you're asking the how of it, which is so important. It gets to those processes and those practices. And so as you mentioned, I've been working and supporting coalitions for over 15 years, both internationally, regionally, and locally. And what I've noticed in the past couple of years is that the work has really evolved. I think when I first started, there was really this idea of an expert coming in, whether it was a designer or a planner or a doctor or a public health expert, coming in and providing direction and guidance. And, you know, our fields have really perpetuated that idea of power, that idea of the expert understanding what needs to happen and coming in and prescribing what the solution is. But I've seen that shift in the last couple of years, which has been amazing. And it's a shift that really is moving to this idea of for us, by us. And so the two examples that I would love to talk about are one in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and then the other one in Niagara Falls. So Brownsville, for those of you that don't know, is a neighborhood that's about 2.2 square miles in Brooklyn. It has the highest concentration of public housing in all of North America, and has had decades of city agencies, whether it's Department of Health, DOE, Department of Education, or city planning, coming in and really, quote unquote, fixing the neighborhood and saying that we have a solution and this is the flavor of the month and we're gonna try this out on this neighborhood, right? And so it was everything from different after school programming, different health interventions, different street designs. And when I first started working there, it was an organization that was an outside organization that came in that said, we have answers and we want to implement them here in the neighborhood. And I think one of the amazing things was that there really was a pivot, and it was really centered on a specific street within the neighborhood. Belmont Avenue was historically a main thoroughfare of this neighborhood, in which it was a center for entrepreneurship. It was a center of local businesses, of connection, of community, and it had really fallen on harder times. It really was kind of that boil that Molly talked about in the beginning of this conversation. And so what happened was two things. One, a leader in Brownsville, Greg Jackson, who really had a lot of connections with agencies and organizations outside of the neighborhood, passed away very, very suddenly. And he was really the unofficial mayor of the neighborhood. And I think that a lot of people really realized that without him, it was up to them to really figure out what needed to happen and the how of it. And while that was going on, there was a really important organization that was majority there was majority folks who were from the neighborhood working in the organization. So the Brownsville Community Justice Center really put a stake in the ground and said, you know what, we're actually moving to Belmont Avenue. This is the history of the neighborhood and we actually wanna, we want to do business here. And that really, those two things, the death of Greg and actually the action of the Brownsville Community Justice Center, really rallied folks around this idea that the solution is within us and that we actually have the opportunity to think about what it looks like by us and for us. And so the dynamic changed from city agencies or organizations coming in and saying, we have the answers and we're going to implement it here, to residents saying, stop, we're not going to be attending your meetings. We're actually not even going to listen to what you're saying. We're going to create the solutions and we are going to invite you to come in and actually support us in that solution building. And so the other example that I'd like to give is a very, very different neighborhood, the north end of Niagara Falls. And, you know, there's an organization there called the Create a Healthier Niagara Falls Collaborative, which is a coalition that focuses on shared leadership. It's entirely staffed by residents who are not drawing a salary on this coalition. They all have day jobs. And this is something that they've put together to really think about what they want to be doing for their neighbors and for their community. most people, when they think about Niagara Falls, they think about the falls, right? They think about this natural wonder. And what people don't really think about is the fact that this is a community that actually was the last stop on the Underground Railroad. When we talk about Harriet Tubman, she crossed the suspension bridge in Niagara Falls. And the Create a Healthier Niagara Falls Collaborative has been an amazing force in really thinking about what does it look like within this neighborhood and within this city, to think about solutions for us and to actually feature our folks in this neighborhood that have been creating solutions from the beginning of time. And so they really work together in a couple of different ways. One way is that they actually, very similar to what was going on in Brownsville, actually demanded that they were a part of all city decisions and were a part of all changes within the neighborhood itself. So with the hundreds and thousands of dollars coming in from the tourism industry, the Create a Healthier Niagara Falls Collaborative that's only local residents really said that we have to be at the decision-making table to actually say where those dollars go and how and where and when and why. And so there was that piece of actually being a part of the political processes, but then they also really thought about what it looked like to leverage the fact that there was so much history in the neighborhood. And so this idea, what I mentioned before about Niagara Falls being the last stop on the Underground Railroad, they really thought about what it looked like to engage local residents in telling that story. And not just telling the story of, the figures that are always a part of the narrative. So Harriet Tubman is one that we always talk about, but actually who the local heroes were in Niagara Falls that actually have descendants that live there today. And so the manifestation of that was an actual trail from the north end of Niagara Falls, where most of the residents live and is not the tourist area, to the tourist area of the suspension bridge, and a trail in which they actually have murals that depict all local heroes. And what was amazing about that is that the Create a Healthier Niagara Falls Collaborative worked with the tourism department to train up local ambassadors to actually be the storytellers, right? And so it's saying, we are a part of this and we actually hold a lot of power in the change. And it's not just these folks with money or these folks who come for these other ideas or thoughts, that they're actually important things that we get to talk about too.
That's really great. And I love kind of something that's coming out as you're talking about these great examples is that you're really connecting people in place. And that's something that I think is so important. I've been saying throughout all of this, kind of movement, we're in Black Lives Matter, but Black places matter, Black spaces matter, right? And the understanding that there's this connection between people and their places is really coming out, I think, in both of these examples that you shared with Brownsville, right? Like coming to Belmont Avenue, and we're gonna build here. We're gonna to sort of make this our place and make sure that we're connecting together. It's really wonderful, and seeing how these things connect to how people feel, right? I think the public health and really any of these sort of larger kind of systems and policies, people get into like the metrics and the figures and asthma rates and diabetes and violent crime and educational attainment. So all of these things just become these drivers. It's a little frustrating at times. But what you were just talking about is kind of what do people feel? How do they feel connected to their space? How does that affect their relationships? How does that affect their kind of just ability to be in kind of healthy interactions with other people? So I'm just curious, like, as you're doing this work, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, and I think,
dynamic?
I think one of the things that I want to highlight in that example is that we can talk about the drivers in an example like that, right? We can talk about increased walkability, which leads to more physical activity, which leads to health. We can talk about the fact that there was a study that showed that as folks green vacant lots, mental health improves in that neighborhood. So that was a study that was done in Philadelphia. And there was a lot of studies that were actually done in Philadelphia as well around the Mural Arts Project, right? And how mental health changed as that was coming up within the city and the neighborhood, right? And so we can do that. We can have that conversation. But I think the essence of it is really, how do people feel and what is their sense of belonging in that space and place? And is it a project, initiative, intervention that is for them, and is it by them? And I think if you're able to answer those questions as yes, then you can get to all of the other pieces, that it is, you know, it improves mental health, it increases physical activity, it supports social cohesion, which we have seen is a huge driver around health and increased health, especially during this time. So we can have those conversations, but I think the core of it is, who gets to decide what the project is and how does that project happen, right? And if we're not able to say that it is for the residents and by the residents, I think the other questions are moot.
Right. This is a really, really powerful point, the for us, by us, and the who question. And I'll bridge it to something that just came up in the conversation with Bryan, you know, who gets to design? Right? Who really gets to have a say? And some of these examples that you've been talking about, I think really challenge us to think about that, because that allows us to challenge our fields, right? It allows us to like break down these kind of silos or walls really of presumably having expertise, right? Like you said, the kind of the outside solutions and best practices that may not connect and relate really in a community, especially in time.
And I think one of the things that I think you've heard me say this because you've known me for so long and we've worked together in Brownsville, but a lot of what I talked about, you know, and I think we need to think about this in our profession as well, is who are we in the work, right? So for me as a child of immigrants, I am from both nowhere and everywhere. And I need to understand what is my role in this work, right? And so my work in Brownsville, I was very clear with people. I may have a master's in urban planning and I may have a master's in public health. I do not have a master's in Brownsville. And these are all equal, right? And we need to work together and put our degrees on the table, whether it's urban planning, public health, or the neighborhood, right? And they are equal, if not the neighborhood degree, more than the other ones, right? And that we are in service of, and I think Bryan mentioned that as well, we are in service of what the vision is for these neighborhood leaders. We are not leading it ourselves.
Amazing. And it's, you know, we need more U of O's, right? Like it's a good to get where you get your master's in Orange, your master's in Brownsville, your master's in New Haven, right? There's probably, you know, New Haven famous, every university, the town gown thing. And you know, how do we value and elevate and center some of that work as knowledge and kind of what's needed for practice, particularly in place-based work, right? Design ultimately is so much kind of place-based. So thank you, Nupur. That's your time as well. And we're ready to actually come to a group discussion. And we've got already some great questions coming in from our audience. And so if our guests can sort of pop up on the camera, we're going to start calling on some people from the audience for audience questions. So the first is coming up from Bridget. So Bridget, if you're interested, you can unmute and you can ask your question, which was to Bryan.
Sure, I'd love to, because he kind of answered my first questions, then I had to change it to follow up. Bryan, you were talking about design strategies to really punch a hole in the racist policies and the history that we have. And my immediate thought was of the physical. I'm an architecture student. And then your examples had nothing to do with the physical. So I've got to change my question to, as architects, we kind of get told that our role is to design the building. But what I'm hearing from you and from Nupur is that that really isn't our role. Our role maybe is something else. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both and, right? I mean, I think what we've been told is that our role is purely and singularly to design the building. And what we're saying is that our role is far exceeds that limited purview, right? It really requires us to be actively, not just in communities for engagement purposes or research purposes or extraction purposes, but to be of community, right? Like, actually, like there's no real reason that we should be designing for people and without any connection to those communities. And so really the design strategy itself is that our organizing at the front end of any project is not is not a point that starts and ends. It should have been there beforehand, and it we should be building power so that it lasts afterwards. We should be building relationships so that it lasts afterwards, because it's not about a singular project. One project that you do will not change the world. The precedents that we set through the design of space and the relationship between Okay.
We can hear you, Bryan. We can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
I got a little, yeah.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay. Did y'all hear any of that? I just spoke for like 3 minutes.
I had an audio problem, but I didn't know if it was you or me, so I was messing with my thing. So
Okay.
I cannot speak for anyone else other than that. I did not hear the past that.
Okay, let me just ask Bridget. Bridget, did you hear what I just said?
Oh, okay. Jen and Gus said in the chat that there was an audio problem.
Okay.
So you might as well just.
All right, here we go. I'm gonna try, give it a go one more time. All right, so what I was saying was essentially that what architecture school and what our kind of pedagogy tells us is that it is singularly a design consideration. And what I think what we are trying to articulate here is that it is both a design problem and a kind of community organizing, community relationship consideration, right? They are inextricable to one another. And so as we start to think about what design is, and we have no relationship to who the people are, we are bound to continue reproducing and manufacturing systems of oppression through those spaces that we're building. And so the way that I would really frame it is really that our work as designers should be able to translate the experiences and the expectations, the visions, the dreams of community into the spatial implications that can truly define and support community power and truly define and support outputs of space that are lasting communal spaces over time.
Yeah, that's great, and it's sort of prompting me to remember a question that I had really for all of you, which was that I know that you did a U of O project together, benchmarking. So I don't know how you're going to do it, but sorry, can you tag team a little bit just to talk about your experiences with that? Because I think it directly addresses that issue that you just raised.
I can tell sort of the origin story of that, and then Nupur and Bryan could share a bit of their experience. So in Orange, we were working on engaging neighbors and visioning for what could happen at the site of the train station in Orange, which at the time was really just like a big parking lot, but is really like a welcoming point and a meeting point for the city, and also one block off of Main Street. So we were really trying to think of how this space could really start to get at some of the issues Bryan is talking about, like really support the community, build community power, like really support communal life of the city, as opposed to just be sitting there. And one of the things that was identified was just like a lack of like a lack of seating. And and we started doing projects at U of O to start enacting at the train station, like how we would want it to be. So like there's no like newspaper or coffee vendor. It's kind of, it's a closed station, but we would pop up and like give people free newspapers and coffee and like have music. And so so one of the events that we held was a benchmaking contest where people created these benches to enliven the space and think about public infrastructure in the space, but also to like really get their hands on like to physically start creating the city. And at U of O, one of our colleagues had invited her uncle to offer classes in bench making, because we're like, we'll have a contest with them, like people have to learn how to make benches. So he created a very simple method to make a bench that anyone could do, but then everyone started coming with all these ideas, like, hey, Uncle Frank, like, but I want my bench to be reversible and go like this and that. And so, and Nupur and Bryan were both able to join us that day, coming from totally different perspectives at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I was, at that time, I was, I think I was still a student of public health at that time. And, you know, what was amazing about it was the opportunity to imagine alternative realities in a very, very micro level question that often is never even asked, right? So like usually when you think about like benches or community meetings, it's like, what's the color of the bench, or where should the bench be located? Mm-hmm. But the idea around it was the fact that it's like, can we even be rethinking what a bench could look like, be made of, situated, how can it make you feel a very, very different way? And the ability to be able to see all of that literally in one space, and have this universe of alternatives. It, like, when we're talking about mental health, like, it expands your mind in a completely different way.
Yeah. Being able to see like the resolution of vision in one place is very, very impactful. And just even to speak on that, like, you know, to me, that moment is such a, and I've called Male about this a little bit, but that was such a pivotal moment in my life. I had just graduated and the market crashed. There were no jobs. And so I was like really, really depressed. I mean, it was probably one of the lower points in my life. And that process of getting to work with young people. So I worked with Youth Build in Orange over the course of a month, give or take, to work with them to figure out, you know, what kind of benches they wanted to build. And so there were 2 different groups, and we built like 4 benches, and it was just amazing process that really pulled so much out of me that I had been bearing through that moment in time. And to see the young people, to see how they interacted, to see their joy and pride was so impactful. And so it was the impetus for so many things to come. I mean, it helped you know, guide me as we started to think about what Project Pipeline was moving forward. That's now been 10,000 students over the course of the last 10 years. And it shapes so much. So again, I mean, I said this before, but again, thank you, Male. Thank you, Nupur, for being in that space. Cause it was just, it was amazing.
And Bryan, that mentioning how him and his youth team won big.
Oh yeah, we did. I want to go there, but yeah, we did. I have we won 5 different awards that day. So yeah, it was a good one.
But I think, you know, I think that this piece is really important, Bryan, what you're talking about in terms of the opportunity, or kind of the need to be able to be thinking about supportive spaces and places and incubators to think about alternative realities, right? And so when we're talking about like the design profession as a whole, yes, there's a piece around thinking about the profession and what is our role in that, but it's also thinking about what is the way in which we are encouraging folks and paving the way for folks who are from these neighborhoods to take our jobs and to be able to design for themselves, right? Absolutely. And I know that Justin can share with us his experience within that. He is like a walking, talking, like brilliant example of an organization that did that, a firm that did that. And so thinking about that piece of it, but then also as we're thinking about and doing this work at the intersection, what are the ways that we're supporting each other such that there is work that is very local in the vernacular, but there is also a need to be able to create our like subject matter coalition and understand like who are the people who are doing this work in which we can support one another, bounce ideas off of each other, and kind of grow from that.
Yeah. I'm going to put a pin in this because thank you, all of you. I just love this. I love that project. So I was like, we have to talk about it. But I think it's important in other ways because it helps us talk about our practice, right? And like, what do we do in the world? What is your purpose? You know, what are you good at? What are you not good at? And it's fine if you're not good at something. It's fine if you're under stress. It's fine if you're feeling down, right? Like we have to allow for that. And the design and built environment fields are terrible at that. They're not good at creating space for you to feel like you're not well, right? And like the culture of architecture schools especially, let's not even get into it, but you all know what I'm talking about. And, you know, we have to imagine and build different alternatives. So that's why I love this story about the benches, because what do you call it, Nupur? Like this, like possibilities, right?
Yeah, the universe of alternative possibilities.
Universe of alternative possibilities, right? What if all the 159 people here, what if we made that our collective job? Right? If, you know, designers, built environment people, people who care about people who care about environments, we know it's not working. It clear, like we're all living through it right now. We're on this Zoom thing right now because clearly it's not working, right? And Nupur's point exactly, like how do we build our networks, our spaces, our interactions to help us go into a different mode, a different place. I think I love this story just because it is such an illustration of that, right? Like starts at the bench, but then ultimately an idea sparks, and now there are 10,000 young people that may have been exposed to a different way of being in the world, right? Or seeing how they may have some small part in shaping the world, right? The Angela Davis quote, you know, you have to imagine that you can radically transform the world and you have to do it all the time. Right? It's like caring for each other is something that we have to learn how to do all the time. We have another good question from the audience. It's from Andre. So Andre, I don't know if you want to unmute.
Sure, I'll unmute.
Sure, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, sure, if I can find it. All right, so my question was, who the we in the community is in the community? Is it determined by length of stay or amount of involvement in said communities?
Who is we? That's a good one.
Hi, Andre. Thank you so much for your question, which I think is really, really hugely important because we can all fall into using catch-all terms or using terms that can become co-opted or meaning not what you say to, or not being specific and precise in our language. And I think it's important that we have specificity in our language often. And when I used to work as a research assistant in my mom's office at the city's research group at Columbia University of Mailman School of Public Health, we actually took a lot of time to really dig into that question because we were based in Washington Heights and working a lot in Harlem, and people often were saying like the community. And so basically, scientifically speaking, the way we approach that is that the official definition of the word community is that it's a group of people with something in common. And so you can be a community of people who really love comic books. You can be a community of people who what you share in common is that you live in the city of Orange. And so at U of O, for example, like we serve the city of Orange, we serve people in the larger Essex County, as you can hear from our relationships with Justin and Nupur and Bryan. We also serve communities of urbanists. So we try to, but I do think it's important to try to think through with some precision when you're thinking about that word community, because it can sometimes be like, well, we know what we mean when we say it, and you know what I mean, but do we? So I don't know if that was a helpful answer for you, and I would love to hear what Nupur and Bryan have to say, but I just know that sort of from that perspective of thinking about it from a research perspective, working at the School of Public Health, that was the way that we spoke about it, and then sort of trying to aim for specificity.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a really great example with some of my work in East Harlem as they embarked on some participatory budgeting. You know, participatory budgeting is when there's a bucket of funding and folks get to decide who are a member of that community. They get to decide where that money goes. And they were having a lot of really interesting discussions about it, and actually decided to include different groups of people and weight their votes accordingly. So they actually had, you know, with this event where folks were voting where the dollar should go, people who were residents actually got 3 votes. So every vote that they had counted 3 times. People who were business owners counted I think it was 2 times. And then folks who were friends of were an entirely different group. And I can't remember if it was 1 or a half. So, you know, it's really interesting because the East Harlem community during that process actually had very similar conversations. The result of it was actual dollars. And so they wanted to make sure that folks were included in specific ways, but wanted to have the heart of it be folks who were living in that neighborhood themselves.
Yeah, technically, how you weight those who have been in communities, I think that's cute. So there's like 2 points that I try to make when it comes to this particular conversation. One is that we often conflate words, neighborhood and community. Neighborhood and community are not the same thing. Neighborhood is the geographic boundary of place, and community or communities are the kind of, again, the social relationships or the groups that have an affinity for place, but are not necessarily bound to that place. That's why we can force communities or displace communities, right? And so that's an important thing to know. The second thing is that there is no community, there is multiple communities. We are always in palimpsest. Everyone on this call is part of multiple communities. And so we have to recognize that palimpsest and live with the complexity of that, and ultimately allow for that complexity to create sort of a Venn diagram that starts to give you the spaces and places where you can see the relationships between all of those relative communities. And so you're asking some of the questions, you're getting people to a point to express their experiences in relationship to that. And so it's very hard to define it, but ultimately you do have to start to understand you know, what's given, right? So that the elders in a community often are the ones who can start to delineate and tell you who's been in community for a long time, those who are often neglected from the conversations that we have. And so speaking to your elders is absolutely crucial, making sure that young people who are often neglected from these conversations are at the table, because they're also not necessarily always considered community, right? They're considered a community off to its own, right? And we'll deal with what they say with a heavy grain of salt, right? And so we have to be very clear about those things. So I just think, you know, recognizing the palimpsest, recognizing those who have done work, who have been there for long times, and who have the vested interest of place in mind. But you yourself will not define community. The community will define itself.
That's great. Thank you all, and thank you, Andre, for that question. I think it's a really important one, especially, you know, if we talk about kind of the mental health topic, and frankly, there is a conversation about community with people that may be experiencing some of the more serious impacts of negative mental health, and the many conversations, whether it's about homelessness or access to broader healthcare systems, and you know, we need to have a broad understanding for who is we, right? And so
I'll give another example that could highlight some of that. And when you were talking, it actually just popped up in my mind, especially when you started talking about kind of what we're dealing with right now in terms of the mental health challenges and really the pandemic that we're having right now. So one of the communities that I work with, or Brian, one of the neighborhoods that I work with is in the Lower East Side in New York City. And one of my grantees, as a funder, one of my grantees is University Settlement. So they have a history of being a settlement house, have been in that neighborhood for over 100 years. And their action has always been, or their the group of folks that they serve has always been older adults. And it's always been physical, and it's been in person, right? So they have specific centers, they do meal provision, programming, all that type of stuff. And of course, when COVID happened, seniors were the most vulnerable, did not feel comfortable leaving their house at all. And University Settlement said, rightfully so, we will make sure that you have food, we will make sure that you have what you need. And started seeing, you know, within a matter of weeks, the isolation and the detriment to mental health that folks were experiencing. And so they decided to go above and beyond kind of the phone calls that they were making for older adults, just doing the health check of, did you eat something today? Did you take your medication? And we kind of really thought about what were the ways in which we could strengthen and maintain the community that is they've been working on for 100 years, and developed an oral history project in which University Settlement staff members were, yes, doing the health checks of like, did you eat? Did you take your medicine today? But also tell us about the neighborhood 50 years ago, 100, like tell us about, you know, what brought you to this neighborhood, right? And it was really thinking about the fact that, you know, at a time when the city was really kind of providing Chromebooks and laptops and iPads, and you had a group that was not really even able to use a smartphone, they were just really using landlines to have these conversations, started recording them, and is now thinking about what are the ways in which residents can dial in and listen to each other's stories and maintain that cohesion even though they physically cannot be together. So that was just another example that I wanted to share because it's so poignant and it's so of this moment of thinking about where are we at right now and what do we have and what do people feel comfortable even doing in this moment, and how can that support their mental health?
That's really great, Nupur. Thank you for sharing that. And I think so much of this work is about the stories. It is about the narrative and kind of the impact that has on really shaping our cities and our communities, but also shaping our experiences that may have, you know, many different kinds of impact. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, but these stories and these narratives are something that we have to become more comfortable with accepting as a part of our work and practice in many ways. With that, I'm going to thank our three wonderful panelists, Molly, Brian, and Nupur. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin.
Much gratitude for sharing this space and conversation among us and amongst this broader community. Hopefully we're gaining some compatriots in this work. Brian, quick plug for DAP.
Yes, indeed. Those of you who would like to join the ranks of revolutionaries, please check out dapcollective.com. We are organizing not just for Black lives, but for Black communities, for Brown communities. We are making sure that we are actively making sure that design has a role to play in the survival of communities that have historically been disinherited. So join us.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And with that, thank our panelists again. And I'm going to pass it off to Dean Deborah Burke and the organizers to close us out. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. And thank you all. This has really been an extraordinary evening and the culmination of a truly outstanding symposium. And while in some ways I'm sorry it couldn't take place in Rudolph Hall in the second half of spring semester of 2020 as originally planned, it in many ways became a better symposium, more inclusive, much more accessible series of events through being delivered remotely. As I said in my opening remarks, we at the school are grateful to the family of J. Irwin Miller for their gift of an endowment in his memory that allows us to have symposia like this at the School of Architecture, so thank you. I would really, from the bottom of my heart, like to thank the symposium's organizers, students and recent graduates, Kate Altman, Mariana Riobam, Gus Steyer, Jen Shim, Jackson Lindsay, and Araceli Lopez. As I've had the chance to tell you guys off screen, I'll say again now on screen, this has been an incredible symposium. Thank you for your work and the enormous commitment to it. Your commitment of time, thought, and effort, truly incredible. I'd also like to thank the faculty advisors who worked with the students on this symposium, Joel Sanders and Elihu Rubin from the School of Architecture, Jessica Helfand of the Design Observer, Cheryl Holbrook from the School of Management, and Phil Corlett and Michael Rowe from the School of Medicine. Additional support, advice, and assistance at the School of Architecture was provided by Associate Dean Phil Bernstein, Events Coordinator Richard DeFlumery, and the school's Director of Communications, AJ Artemel. Thanks to you all as well. And finally, thanks also to all of our many speakers and moderators, each of you brilliant. The organizers will be thanking you individually very shortly, but my very sincere thanks as well. It is hard for me to be able to describe the importance of this symposium being held at the School of Architecture in the brief time that I have for closing remarks tonight, but I can assure you I will be speaking about it a lot in the future to colleagues across Yale, across academia, and in the professional world of design and the built environment. Many of our speakers were not architects, yet through this interdisciplinary discussion, we, an audience of mostly architects and designers, learned a lot. And as I mentioned, the virtual format turned out to be its own and unexpected gift. The symposium spanned across multiple time zones and continents. We had over 1,000 people register for the event, and I cannot tell you how excited we are about that. That's good news, and there are some specifics within the good news. Welcome to Justin's students from Morgan State. Professor Alex Schwader is weaving the contents of the symposium into this class, Design for Mental Health, which he is teaching at Pratt in the Department of Interior Design and Industrial Design, and in collaboration with the National Alliance for Mental Illness, on mental illness, I should say, excuse me. Professor Trudy Watt at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee has woven attendance in the symposium into the elective studio she's teaching this semester. And here at Yale, we continue to push forward with collaborative opportunities with our colleagues at the schools of medicine, public health, and nursing. We share with them the strongly held belief that design must have a positive impact and that designers have a professional responsibility to contribute to the creation of a positive, non-stigmatizing built environment for all, one that would address the goals spoken about by so many of the participants in this symposium. This was an inaugural event, the first event of its kind, at least that we know about. The symposium is an interdisciplinary collaboration and will be hosted by other schools at Yale in years to come. We are delighted to already be working with faculty from across the university who form our standing committee. And this team represents faculty from the law school, the School of the Environment, the School of Public Health, the School of Art, School of Management, the Divinity School, the School of Medicine, and the School of Nursing, all of whom are committed to supporting the next iteration of the Yale Mental Health Symposium as it moves between schools across the university. As Molly Kaufman said earlier this evening, everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. Molly, I'm going to be quoting you quite often. That was great. One can never give sincere and heartfelt thanks often enough. So again, thank you. Thank you all for your time, your energy, your interest, and your commitment to a better built world for everyone. And I'd now like to hand it over to the symposium's organizers for their closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Deborah, for those thoughtful reflections. And thank you for your steadfast support throughout the development of the symposium this last year and more. The symposium would have also not been possible without the support of our advising team. Please know that we are so grateful for your dedicated support and belief in this initiative.
This inaugural Yale Mental Health Symposium gathered together 18 speakers and moderators. Mindy Thompson-Fololove with Elihu Rubin, Kelechi Ubozo, Christian Carlson, Jason Danziger, Martin Voss, and Matthew Steinfeld. Allison Cunningham, Earl Chambers, Sam Semberis, and Jessica Helfand. Chris Payne, Hannah Hull, and Joel Sanders. Bryan Lee, Nupur Chaudhury, and Justin Garrett Moore. And Molly Kaufman, sorry. Thank you for coming together to be present in generating novel discussion and building new knowledge about mental health and the built environment. We thank you for your important work.
Through 5 public events, this symposium examined mental health and the built environment across 3 scales: the hospital, the home, and the city.
Mindy Thompson-Fololove's keynote taught us about the importance of social integration and repairing the historic splintering of urban segregation. The hospital panel showed us ways to remove trauma from treatment and destigmatize mental illness from spaces. The home panel navigated designing for health equity and asserted housing as a human right. Architectures of Mental Health showed us the healing power of art and explored with us the ethics involved in working towards improved mental health care.
Tonight's panel on the city parsed how design and urbanism has historically codified systems of racism, resulting in an erosion of culture and communities in our cities. But our panelists tonight also generously shared tools and collaborated with us to discuss methods of how we might begin to reknit and reconnect our social fabric for collective recovery and healing. With over 600 individual attendees and over 1,000 individual registrants, we can see there is a hunger and an urgency in this moment to examine and change the systems of institutional violence that inflict racial trauma and pivot towards community building to make mental health care accessible and equitable.
Conversations created here in the past weeks are only the beginning. We encourage everyone watching at home to push this work forward and amplify the lessons we learn here within your own communities. We urge you to recognize your own agency, hold space for these types of conversations in your school and workplace with your clients and colleagues. One consistent piece of feedback we have received throughout these weeks is the wonder and inspiration that comes out of building interdisciplinary knowledge that frees us to imagine new solutions to old problems. Build the muscles of interdisciplinarity, conversation, and break down silos of knowledge with your own places of work, study, and life.
As the symposium travels to other professional schools within Yale, continue to watch this space. Our website will serve as a resource for ideas and conversations, housing the recordings of our programs as well as the outcomes from an upcoming workshop among participants. Please reach out to us if you are interested in sharing your own work. We are calling for collaboration.
So we want to close by circling back to the video of the dancing girl shared by Mindy Thompson-Fololove at the end of her keynote lecture. As our symposium comes to a close, we reflect on the joy this little girl embodies as she invents her own movements and asserts her own knowledge. The work of destigmatizing mental health and reimagining new forms of mental health care will require that each of us tell our own stories as we build to make a more equitable mental health infrastructure. So to all of you at home, thank you so much for joining us these past weeks as we look together beyond the visible, at space, at place, and at power in mental health. Good night, everyone.